On episode 29, I did a love letter to HTC of old, and I mentioned a certain device, the HTC Mogul, also known as the Pocket PC 6800, which is literally my favorite HTC phone, and that's why this episode of Tech with Josh, episode 35, is titled My Favorite HTC Phone. What's so special about this phone? Well, it came out in 2007, and it was a PDA. PDA stands for Personal Digital Assistant. Back in those days, this is the same year that the first iPhone came out, by the way. So back in those days, you had PDA devices, which were personal digital assistants that had your calendars, your email, your to-do list, contacts. So smartphones were considered PDAs because of these functions. Before the modern smartphones, sometimes you had a Palm Pilot, which did all of this with no cellular or phone capabilities. So it just held your information. They had Windows mobile devices as well. So they started implementing it with phones. So you had the Pocket PC 6600, the 6700, and the 6800, the one I'm going to talk about today, which ran Windows Mobile. So it was a version of Windows in your pocket. It used the Microsoft Exchange ActiveSync to sync over everything from Outlook. So that's how you got your contacts, your calendar, and your email sync by hooking up to the computer. And like I said, this is 2007, so let me give you some background for me. In 2007, I was working in Circuit City. For those of you who are too young to know what that is, it's a competitor, or it was a competitor of Best Buy. And I was working as a technician. And I was also a freshman in college at this time. So, with that information, let me tell you why this phone was my favorite phone of the time, and a phone that nothing else could compete with at the time, even the first iPhone. So, as I mentioned, it ran Windows Mobile. It had a touchscreen. It was a 2.8-inch touchscreen, 240 by 320. So not the sharpest display, but this is the time, like I said, the first iPhone came out. This was a traditional touchscreen, so it wasn't like the iPhone that you can just use your fingers, things like that. No, it had a stylus. So on the bottom right, it had the stylus. So you have to use the stylus to use it, or you can navigate with the directional pad on the front of the device or the jog wheel on the side, which is just a wheel that goes up and down. So the key feature of this is you could slide it and you'll have a full keyboard. Nowadays, full keyboard on phones, yuck, nobody wants that, just like Steve Jobs said about stylus. But the reason it was so great is because, like I said, the iPhone was the first real phone with a touchscreen that you can use your fingers on, a capacitive touchscreen, instead of a pressure sensitive one, and the first real phone with an on-screen keyboard that was great. So before that, you had flat-out keyboards or candy bar phones with the keyboards there, but they were much smaller on the palm, so that's why this, since it was a landscape, was a bigger keyboard. So it allowed me to type faster through tests, IM, things like that. But the main thing about this phone was the operating system. As I mentioned time and time through this, is Windows Mobile, which means you can have apps. So with these phones, there was no app store like we have now with the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store, none of that. You had to buy software from companies or find CAB files. CAB was a file type that you can find for Windows Mobile. Just like Android had APK files, for Windows Mobile you will have CAB files or Palm files. Palm Trios will have their own. So you will find software. And one of the softwares that were around during that time was VLC. VLC is still around today, VideoLAN player. And it basically plays any file type. And why this is important is because in college, I was watching movies on my phone. I would rip certain things from DVDs at home or Netflix at the time, and I would just play on my device, transfer it. I had a micro SD card slot. I had like a 2 or 4 gig card at the time, and this is AVI files, so it's not super big files like a movie, probably 700 megs at most. And you would just, like I said, get Netflix, rip it, and then put it on the device. And that's the main thing. I love that. So when I'm in class, I have a headphone in and I'm just watching actual shows on my device, Family Guy, The Office, whatever, right then and there on that screen. It was a huge screen to me because I was used to a T-Mobile Sidekick or the T-Mobile Dash, which is also the HTC Excalibur, which has smaller screens. So I had this touchscreen that was huge to me at 2.8 inches. QVGA, I don't care about that. But it's just the ability to do that. I also had an app that allows stereo or Bluetooth for audio support. So nowadays, you can have one headphone in and have audio. Back then, no, if you had the Motorola Bluetooth that had the little stem that flipped out to turn on. Of course, I had one, I think it was like the H650 or something like that. So that couldn't do audio for media. So you had to have an app that did. So Windows Mobile allowed me these features so that I can have these functionalities. Whereas on the BlackBerry, I couldn't do that. On the Palm, I never tried to do that because it wasn't that great for multimedia. But with Windows Mobile, because of the operating system and the developers that work on stuff or things you could find in forums was so vast at the time, I was able to get certain apps. So I probably mentioned time and time again, I love this operating system. I had emulators for Nintendo and Super Nintendo on the device. So I was playing games on that, I was watching videos, I had the browser on there, had Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. These might not seem like a big deal in today's world, but this is 2007, 2008. These are big features. You had infrared, so you could still send data to someone else. Because honestly, Bluetooth at the time was slow. So with infrared, I could beam it to my friends who had like a 6700, things like that. So it just allowed me to do so much that my previous phones didn't. And the games on it worked. And like I said, great device overall. Problem is the battery life, of course. So it's removable battery. So I had 3 batteries and I'll just charge them when I get home. Once one's 100%, you can tell from the light turn green. You just swap it with another one and charge it up. And charge the last one overnight. And that's why I love this phone. The only reason I gave it up is because I started working for Sprint at the time in 2008. And the phone was already a year old. They had the 6900, which was all touchscreen, and I was not getting that because it was a downgrade with the features that I had, just overall design, and I still needed a keyboard. As I mentioned, iPhone changed the on-screen keyboard game, and the HTC Touch 6900 actually came out at the end of 2007, but problem is it wasn't that great. Small keyboard, you have to use a stylus. No. So I went with BlackBerry. I did regret losing certain things. I couldn't watch videos like I did before on it. Same way, because there was no VLC for it. Had to be MP4. Just a lot of hoops I had to go through. And I didn't have Microsoft Office on the phone as I did on Windows Mobile. But I did have BBM, BlackBerry Messenger. They did release the HTC Touch Pro, which I got from my father. And then the HTC Touch Pro 2. I never went back to Windows Mobile, though. That ship has sailed because it was an operating system with the Windows Mobile 7 or Windows Phone 7. I hated the operating system, the tiles. It was horrible. And that's when I fell out of love with Windows Mobile, but HTC, as I mentioned in the episode, did do Android. But HTC Mogul was one of my favorite phones of all time. Could you buy one today to play with it? No. Because unless you use the phone when it was new, you can't connect it to any network. You probably can't find any software unless you have some already. And like I said, the specs are comical in today's day and age. It has 96 megs of internal storage. It has a 2 megapixel camera. You can only video record for 30 seconds. And like I said, that display 2.8 inches back then was big. But when my devices have 6 or 7 inch screens, that's not enough. And 1500 milliamp battery. Yep. Like I said, it's a joke compared to today. But back then, it was an amazing phone. And I still have one to this day. It's not my original one. I wish I had that. But I picked one up a few years back for like $20, $30. And it's fun to turn on and just play with it. Has no value other than sentimental. But it was my favorite HTC phone. And that's saying something when I also had the HTC Evo. But that's it for this episode of Tek With Josh. It was more of a retrospective episode on a phone that helped change the way I look at devices. Because of that phone, I did learn how overclock the processor with a certain app. And when Android did come out and when I did get Android phones, I rooted the phones and I went into developer options and did certain things. But it's all courtesy of this phone because this is the first phone that made me want to tinker with phones and do registry edits and things like that. And do custom sounds when you slide it open and close. And that made me become Josh. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.